Hello and welcome to today's tutorial where we're going to be addressing the CSS grid layout system. So to help us, we're going to use this beautiful design provided to us nicely by the folks at Pixel Buddha. So look for Elton UI Kit and get to pixelbuddha.com or .net, and we're going to be using this design. The section that interests us is the widget area that is very appropriate for the grid layout system. So I have some prep code on the left here. Here I have the page, what it's going to look like. And we're going to be just worrying about the layout of these two sections here. So basically, we're going to try to do this without the image, just like the grid system. So to help with measurement, I'm going to be using the studio psdtech.com, which is a very good tool. And along, I'm going to be using Zeppelin too, which is a nice tool for measurement and helping developers be as pixel perfect as possible. So just here for the markup, it's pretty straightforward. And let me go back to the browser. So we have HTML, we set up the background color, and for the HTML and body, we're making sure that there's no padding and no margin. The counter reset is going to be used a little later, and you're going to see why, because we're going to be numbering the boxes since we're just worrying about layout. For the wrapper, we give it a width of 1170. We're not doing anything responsive yet, and we're just giving it a margin top and bottom of 30 pixels, and all those will have it centered. And then basically we're making sure that it doesn't go beyond this bound with the border box in box sizing. So let's address the hero section first. And basically let's have a div that we're gonna call hero. And that's gonna have a class of hero. And let's add a secondary class of fashion hero. And inside of that, we're going to have one div with a class of box. So for our grid section, we're going to do the same thing, but this time the container for it is going to be row. And inside of row, we're going to have 13 boxes. Okay, so that's pretty much most of the markup that we're going to be needing for our layout. So now let's get into the CSS, which is really the goal for this tutorial. And to help with measurement, we have essentially two tools here. If you're using Adobe Brackets, clicking on this icon will get you to PSD Etch, which is pretty cool and allows you to pretty much look at your design and get some measurement out of it. For saving space, I opened it directly in the browser, and that's basically studio.psdetch.com. And as you can see here with the menu, you can get the measurements, meaning that you can click on a layer and basically get the layout. You can do that, but I really prefer to use Zeppelin, which is like my tool of choice to read and understand a design and to get the measurement. So here, looking at this design, I can see that it's the hero here is 1170, so it takes the whole width of the wrapper and 505 pixels, okay? So on the right here, there is some CSS that Zeppelin is already putting in place for us. Let's copy this, basically, and let me paste it first. And let's just indent this real quick. Okay. And here, instead of main form, which is whatever the layer was called, so I'm going to do hero. Actually, fashion hero. And I want to target actually the box that is inside of it, okay? So I'm going to do two things here actually. So the width, we don't really need it since it is a block element. The height we need, it does have a border radius of 3 pixels and a box shadow. But if I go back to our design and I click on it, you're going to see that all the boxes basically have the same CSS rules. So what I'm going to do is essentially take anything that is beside the height here. I'm going to cut that. And just before this rule, I'm just going to have a general rule for all the boxes. Okay? There you go. So all the boxes are going to have this border radius, the box shadow, and the Fashion Hero box has the particularity of being 505 pixel high. Now, the other thing that we can do is, looking at Zeppelin, we see that it has a margin at the bottom here of 29, but I think a plain number is 30. So let's give it a margin bottom of 30 pixels. Okay. Now let's go back to our browser and our design, and this is the hero section, and that's all we're gonna do about it for today. Okay. Now, for the other boxes, they are here in the design, but since we did not give a height to them, basically they don't appear in here. I mean, we could look at it real quick if we were just to give them a height, let's say of 10 pixels. And they are collapsed because there's no margin between them, and give them a margin of 10 pixels, let's say. So you see that they are here, but we're going to be using like a CSS grid to take care of those things. So it's just to show you that they are actually in there. Now we're going to address the width and height with CSS grid. Okay. Now, so to get into CSS grid, we take the container, in this case row, since we gave it the class of row here, and we do display grid. Okay. Nothing changes yet because there's no definition around those boxes yet. They don't hide nothing yet. So let's go back to Zeppelin and look at a couple things that are very important into the way we're approaching the layout with the grid. So here, let's say we're going to take this as our unit, as our atomic unit. So basically, what I mean to say is if we look at this grid as a whole, we have a unit that is at least 270 pixel wide on 238 pixel tall. This is spanning 2 rows, so it's twice the height of this one. And this is spanning 2 columns, so that is twice as large as this one. So we're going to use this one as our base column row. This is going to be by default what a column in our grid, how wide a column in our grid is going to be, and how tall a column is going to be. And then we're going to address the taller and wider rows and columns separately. So first thing is making sure that we have a unified grid. The other thing too is that there's some gap in between like the grid items. And if we hover over, we see that there's 30 pixel gap around. Here it's 30, 29, 29, and 30. So we can safely say that the gap between the grid items is 30 pixels. So the first thing is we have to define the layout of the grid. The layout of the grid, we can define it in terms of columns and rows. So what is the proper syntax for that? Grid, template, columns. Basically, CSS is allowing us to define how we want to lay out our columns, or what size should they occupy. So since we know that 270 to 238 is the base, we need 4 columns of 270 pixels. How do we express that? And I'm going to go back to the browser so you can see it live as I'm coding it. 270 pixels, that's the first column. 270 pixels, that's the second one. 270 pixels. That's the third column, and 270 pixels. Okay. Now we still don't see anything yet because it's at 0. All these divs don't have any height. So if we know that at least a cell in this case has to be 238 pixels, we can just like use the grid auto rows and give them a height of 238 pixels. So something is happening. Now you see that we have something going on in here, which is great, but they are all smashed up together. There's no gap in between. So if you remember, we found out that for the column gap, it's going to be 30 pixels, and the row gap. So the column gap being anything that goes horizontally. So this is the column gaps. And then the row gap, anything that goes, any space that goes between the rows. Okay? So let's express that in our CSS. And it's going to be grid column gap, if you guessed it, good job, of 30 pixels. And you can see that already changing. And you can guess that the next one would be grid row gap, which is going to be 30 pixels too. And then voila, like with about 5 lines of code, we have a solid grid system in place. We have like our 12 rows, 12 cells in columns of 4, and it just wraps to the next line whenever it hits the 4. Okay, so this is basically the gist of it. Understanding basically how you do the layout with this set of rules. You have git template columns, you of course have git template rows, but in this case, for the design that we have, grid auto rows is gonna just be fine. So now let's just condense this. We have grid column gap and grid row gap that are the same unit or the same value. So we can condense it into just one rule. Here, I'm gonna take this out and I'm gonna call it grid gap. So if you have the two being the same, then you don't have to like just repeat that rule, and you can just condense it into one, and it will just like do it for both the column gap and the row gap. Now, the other thing is that you see that we are repeating 270 pretty much 4 times here. So some of you would be like, well, this is not very flexible, and we're talking about grid system, flexible, we're gonna be looking at responsive. How do we take care of this? Okay, so one of the things is to understand that grid gives you a lot of flexibility. So let's say we wanted every third column to be a little larger than the rest or smaller than the rest. So let's give it a 300 pixel, or let's even make it more obvious by giving it 350 pixels here. So you see the overlap, this is pushing this over, and this is really what we're not after, but that's just to give you an understanding of how flexible those grid systems are. Now, pixels are not flexible. No matter what screen resolution you have, it's always going to be 270 or whatever you put in there. What the CSS layout grid has introduced is this concept of dividing the available space into fractions. Okay, so what does it mean is that we can look at this as 4 columns or 4 fractions. Okay, and how do we express that in CSS? We take the fraction unit and we say 1 FR. And you see that I can even mix and match different types of units. So let's say I'll keep this one at 1 FR at 270 pixels, and in the middle here, 1 FR, there's no change. But let's say I change this one to 70 pixels, and then this one, the second or the third column, to 2 FR. So you see that it's occupying two fractions of the available space. This one has a fixed width of 70 pixels, and this one are occupying one fraction of the available space. Okay, so you can mix and match depending of your design that you have in hand. But to get back to the one that we have with the Elton UI kit, basically by default, we want all of them to be one fraction of the grid or the available space. So I'm going to repeat one fraction, and another fraction. Okay, so we get back basically like to square one, where we had a fixed width with the pixels, and now we have a flexible width with the fractions. So the purist in you is going to tell me, okay, we're repeating the same unit. Can we just condense it? Okay, you can condense it by using the repeat function. Basically, instead of that, since we're going to be having the same, so we can do repeat. How many times? 4 times one fraction. Okay, and we get back to square one, but this is very condensed, very nice. And you can mix and match again. I don't want you to feel like constrained. You can always do something like one fraction and then repeat 3 times one fraction. So you see, you can really put that in there if you want, or let's say we want to repeat it 2 times, twice, and the last one we want it to be, let's say, 100 pixels. So you see, this is pretty much showing you how flexible the grid system is. But let's go back to what we had. We want 4 fractions. So let's just do 4 in here, and we don't need this last guy. Okay, so basically the very first step of laying out inside a grid system is done. But now we do have some items that are spanning either into 2 rows or into 2 columns. How do we address that? So I'm gonna go ahead and give these 2 items like the number 2, 3, 4, 5, the number 5 and the number 2. I'm going to give them a class of wide span, and for the tall one, I'm going to give it a class of tall span. Now, to help us kind of look at the grid here, let's just add some numbers inside the boxes. So you remember when I said that we will be looking at the counter reset? Counter reset basically is going to allow us to add just numbers from 1 to X or whatever is the starting. So just a visual cue for us. It's not part of the design, but that allows us to just like know which box we're targeting, okay? So let's add a new rule here, and we're gonna target the boxes that are inside of a row, and we're gonna use the before pseudo element. Okay, let's make sure before we do that to give a relative positioning to our boxes, since we're going to be using the absolute position here. Okay, so what we essentially want to do is we have called our counter reset section, so we have to target that. So counter increment is the property, and we're giving it the same name, we're targeting the same, and the content is going to be counter and section, and you see that it's already starting to put on the numbering system here in the boxes. Okay, all right, Now, let's go back to the design, and you're going to see that if we touch anything near the edge, we're going to see almost a consistent 18 pixel padding around each of these boxes. Okay? So if I touch this little menu here, there's 18 pixels, 20 pixels, 18 pixels. Pixels, 20 pixels. So basically 20 pixels to the left and right, and then 80 pixels, I guess, top and bottom. So let's do that for the boxes first. Let's give it a padding of 18 pixels top and bottom, and 20 pixel left and right. Okay. Now, to put our number, in place, we can be very precise. Let's give it a position absolute with a top of 18 and a left of 20. Okay? And you remember this font that I downloaded, which is the Comforter font. It's very nice on numbers. So let's do font family Comforter, and just as a backup, sans serif. Okay, and finally, let's just since we have the 700 rendering, let's just do font weight 700. All right, so this whole thing was just to like put quickly numbers on the boxes so we know which one we're targeting. Essentially, we're targeting the first box, the second one, and the fifth one. What is cool about brackets, and when you have it open up this way, when I click on the first box, it highlights it in the browser. It's pretty cool. So for the first box, to add the tool span, I'm just gonna add a new class here and call it tool span. And for the second box, I'm gonna add a class of wide span. Finally, for the fixed box 3, 4, 5, I'm going to still add a class of wide span. Okay? Now, coming back into my CSS, for tall span, we want it to span 2 rows. So it would be grid row span 2. And you see how it's already looking so awesome. Wow, I love this thing. And now you can guess that for wide span, instead of grid row this time, because we want it to span across 2 columns, we're going to use grid column. And we're going to do span 2 as well. Et voila. Like just like little magic, the layout that we had here with the widget and this grid system, we have captured that back in code in just a few lines of code. I don't know if you begin to understand or if you begin to see the powerful features that the grid system is allowing you to do, as far as being like respecting the hard work of designers and then rendering it how they intended to. There are many ways that we can do this. If you are old enough to remember the table layout, the float layouts, and Bootstrap, and even recently Flexbox, all of those are great, but none of them is as powerful as what you can do with the grid system. So that's where I'm gonna stop for today. We're gonna be looking at responsive. We're gonna be looking at some edge cases like later on. And if you're interested in having this entire design turn into HTML and CSS and see how you would address it, Please let me know in the comments, and if you have any other idea for other tutorials, let me know too, and I'll be glad to oblige. Thank you and have a wonderful one, and go get some great layouts done. Thank you, bye.